Hello, I'm Paul Perrello, and welcome again to another edition of the Philly Factor. There is a home located in the Spring Garden section of the city that is getting a lot of attention these days, but perhaps not as much attention as it should have been getting over the past few years, if not longer. This home is located at 1601 Mount Vernon Street. It sits there right on the corner. Chances are you may have walked by the home and saw it yourself. You may have stopped to look at the historical marker that is placed outside of the home, or perhaps you may have just walked by and really never paid attention to the home or the marker, and yet the home plays major significance in the history of Philadelphia as well as the history of the United States. This home at one time was the home for Robert Purvis, and you may turn around and say, Robert who? Yeah, Robert Purvis is an important part of our American history and played a major role in the anti-slavery movement here in the city of Philadelphia as well as in the United States. The home has been sitting there since the 1800s. It has fallen into some disrepair. It is currently in litigation, and we'll get into the litigation here in a moment, but I really want to begin with the man Robert Purvis. The Spring Garden Community Development Corporation has sort of taken the lead as to what is going to happen with this home there at 1601 Mount Vernon. Here to talk about the home, about Robert Purvis, is Barbara Wolf. She joins us from the Spring Garden Community Development Corporation. And Barbara, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
As I explained earlier, I'm fascinated by Robert Purvis. And we'll get into the home and the significance of the home and what's going on, but it is ongoing litigation, so anything could change at any moment. But the real important point is that Robert Purvis lived at that home. He actually had two other homes in Philadelphia, one in, I guess, on Lombard Street in downtown Philadelphia, in Center City, and one up in Byberry.
Yes.
Robert Purvis was an integral part in helping slaves make their way to freedom. Now, he didn't house any of the slaves there at 1601 Mount Vernon, but nonetheless, he lived there.
He lived there for almost a quarter of a century, from 1973 to his death in 1873 to his death is 1898. And this is the only house that he owned in the city that he lived in that's still in existence. The other two on around 9th and Lombard and the other up in Byberry across from the Friends Meeting House have both been destroyed. Those were two houses, and each of those where he really had specialized places to hide fugitive slaves and to help them escape to safer areas.
He's an interesting character because he is what we would call today mixed race.
Yes.
His father is of what descent? His father is,
I think, Scottish.
Right.
Scottish merchant from Charleston, South Carolina, where Robert Purvis and his two brothers were born. And his mother was mixed race, with her mother apparently having been captured and enslaved coming from Morocco. So she was, in fact, his grandmother, a slave. His grandfather apparently is reportedly from a prominent Jewish family in Charleston.
He is light-skinned. So that was, some would say, would have worked to his advantage, given the times that he was living in Philadelphia, not only Philadelphia, but anywhere for that matter. And he used it to his advantage to a certain extent, but he was also wealthy, which was unusual for blacks at that time in our history, because we tend to think of them as they were property of white families, but the thing is, he managed to create all this wealth for himself, which he ultimately used in his battle against slavery.
His father died when he was young, I think when he was 16, and left his money, some to his wife, Purvis's mother, but also to the three sons. And from that, he proceeded to invest in property, buying, selling, renting, and through his lifetime was astute at managing and selling property and continued to be wealthy and died a wealthy man. He did use that money a lot. He supported the Liberator, William Lloyd Garrison's works and magazines, and to do that, and spent money on lawyers and efforts for fugitive slaves.
Yeah. I said just a moment ago that he had predominantly white features that he used to his advantage, but did he ever, in your history or in your studying of Purvis, did he shy away from his ethnicity or his background, or did he sort of embrace his background?
He identified himself as a black man, as an American, and he always and he lived in that community. He married Harriet Fortin, the daughter of a prominent James Fortin, a prominent also black sail maker in Philadelphia, and also a wealthy man, and lived in that community. He was at times mistaken for a white man, but he rarely actively used that in his lifetime.
So when he moves to Spring Garden, can you give us a snapshot of Spring Garden back at that time? I mean, I would suspect that it was considered a affluent community, so he would have easily blended in with the other neighbors on Mount Vernon Street or 16th Street?
Much of Spring Garden was developed kind of around the Civil War, post-Civil War, as a development for middle class, upper middle class, business owners, whatever, different people. I don't actually know what the background was, the racial background of that. Initially, when he lived at 9th and Lombard, he eventually moved out from there because there were a lot of riots with black homeowners and black churches being attacked and burnt, and decided at that point to move up to what was then more country, to the Byberry area, really to protect his family. And then moving back into the city, center city, was when his children were grown and out of the house. So like many people now, he's coming back to the city.
The home sits there at 1601
Yes.
Mount Vernon. And as I said, it's currently in litigation because the home is owned by a couple, and the home fell into disrepair, as so often is the case with many homes. And for whatever the reason, actually the back part of the house fell off.
The city demolished it in 2012. There had been long-standing litigation by the city to try to get the owners to do repairs, which they had agreed to and then failed to do. And because of safety issues and worries that it collapsed, the city, L&I, deemed it unsafe and demolished the back L of the property. There was, again, agreements that the owners would fix it up and restore the back walls, and again, they did not follow through with that.
So enter the Spring Garden Community Development Corporation. So can you explain for our viewers what the Development Corporation actually did to either maintain the integrity of the building that still stands there, and what the group would like to see done with the building?
We filed a petition in January of 2018 for conservatorship under Act 135, which allows to take, not own, but to take charge of a building to remediate blighted and conditions in a building. And essentially at that point, we really wanted to stabilize the building and make sure it was not going to deteriorate further, that the front block of the building, of this historic property, wouldn't collapse. So we were finally, after many legal delays with the owners filing for bankruptcy and not getting those because they were deemed kind of bad faith filings in order to prevent the conservatorship. We did finally get conservatorship of it. So we've been stabilized the building. We've been completing renovations to the brickwork, a new roof, a new back wall, and are waiting for a hearing in late March to determine where we will go from here with it. So,
So-
but at least at this point, it's stabilized and not going to fall down.
Yeah. The important thing to note here is that the building, and we've had a few pictures go up on the screen here, the way that property looks like today is not the way that the home was when Purvis lived there. So I know that the home is actually on the Philadelphia Register of Historic Sites.
Yes, and it's the Spring Garden since 2000 is a community, a neighborhood that's designated as a historic district.
I see.
And this building is considered significant to that, partly because of Purvis's ownership and having lived in it, but also because of the facade.
Yeah, but you can see there on the screen, that's what the property looks like.
Looks a lot better now.
It looks a lot better now. Okay, that's good. But if anybody thinks that that's what Purvis's home looked like back in the 1800s, it was a drastically different looking building.
Yeah.
The subsequent owners changed the front with moving the door, and they put brick up over the existing.
It would have always been brick.
Brick, right.
But there would have been a door with limestone steps going up to it, 2 huge windows instead of the commercial storefront. There would not have been the door on the side. And there was the back L that had been there before.
So with that designation, not only for the house but for the district, what does that mean then for developers that might look at a property like this and say, well, we can put in condos there, or we could put apartments, 6 apartments in a building that is some considered single family housing?
The zoning laws will determine the number of units that can go in, whether it can be single family or 4 or 5. I'm not sure what the current zoning law will allow. But work that is done, particularly to the existing front, will have to be approved by the Historic Commission. And they will review, if there's obviously a new L added, they will review that and make some recommendations. But their control is really over what's there historically.
Yeah. So might the Spring Garden Community Development Corporation meet with a potential developer to perhaps bring the at least the facade of the building back to what it might have looked like back in the day?
That would certainly be our hope, and in the past with other properties that we have control over, that we're negotiating with owners and developers about, we really push for that. Ultimately, decisions about that will have to somewhat be decided by the judge in the Common Pleas Court, but also in terms of what we can and what the Historic Commission can encourage if it goes to a developer, what they want to do. Certainly, we would very much like to have something to the original cornice put on it, which is also partly the cornice serves to kind of protect the interior from rain and things like that. It's a practical use as well as a visual aesthetic one, but also the front facade. We would very much promote that. I'm not sure ultimately what control we have over that, but certainly it's something we've been pushing for.
Yeah, and the inside of the building too, I suspect has been radically changed from back in the day.
It's gutted.
It's gutted, yeah.
It's gutted, yeah.
Hypothetical question here is that if this home did not have the significance that it does, being the home of Robert Purvis, would this home, would it have been allowed to fall into the ground and be nothing but a vacant lot today? Because there are many communities throughout Philadelphia that have not necessarily historic homes, but homes that have been abandoned. Their owners have, for whatever reason, just decided they weren't going to put any more money in there. They've left town. There are many, many liens against the home. And then we see on the news that many of these homes collapse onto existing homes. So I wonder if there was no historical significance attached to this home, what would have been the corner, what would it look like?
Well, I think simply that it's in a historic district, even if it wasn't Robert Purvis's house, would have meant there's some control over that.
Sure.
But this house has been litigation with the city, with L&I complaints, with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of penalties and fines against the owners for neglect. But that really didn't stop its continuing neglect. So it's complicated even in cases where it's an important historic figure, or should be a better known historic figure, to force owners to make those changes, and to do so. But certainly not being in a neighborhood that's historic district, or not having someone having lived in it of historic importance, makes properties more vulnerable.
Yeah.
I know the Preservation Alliance is hoping to get with the city a program where for historic and properties that families can have a resource to borrow from or have some assistance to keep historic properties up to date so that they can be maintained, because it can be pricey with an elderly property to keep up the way it should be. So.
Yeah, we should mention that there is a historical marker, a state historical marker that's on the corner or right in front of the house, which stipulates or states that Purvis actually housed slaves there on the way to freedom, but he actually, it's been documented, it's actually documented that he did not keep slaves. So it's not a stop on the Underground Railroad like the other two properties were, correct?
No, because he did not live there until 1873, which is after the Civil War and after the Emancipation Proclamation. So it was not there. His other two properties had clearly designated spaces, the one at 9th and Lombard, under the children's play area. And when he moved up to Byberry, before they moved in, he specifically had a renovation done so they could have an area to protect fugitive slaves, to hide there. So those were areas where he actively kept slaves and fugitive slaves, and multiple ones, but not at this property.
Yeah. So why is it, do you think, we have not heard much about Robert Purvis? I mean, here he is, you know, a major movement, you know, in the anti-slavery, you know, chapter in American history, and yet his name doesn't resonate with the likes of Harriet Tubman, who also, we have learned, you know, moved slaves through the Philadelphia area onto freedom. And yet Purvis, I suspect, if it wasn't for this situation at 1601 Mount Vernon, we would know little, if anything, about him.
Right. And I think it's really unfortunate because he's just a remarkable man who also worked to keep the vote for free blacks before they were disenfranchised in the Pennsylvania Constitution Convention at 1838. He worked hard because before that blacks with property could vote. He worked hard for actually women's rights, and one of the first people to support women's rights and suffrage, and home rule in Ireland, even though a lot of the race riots and attacks on the blacks were coming from Irish immigrants. So and in his lifetime, when he died, the New York Times wrote about him as the president of the Underground Railroad. And he spoke about his committee and everyone altogether having rescued 9,000 slaves, or helped to kind of channel them through to safe areas going through Philadelphia. So I think some of it may have been his modesty. I think there may be many people out there, because I don't think when you are doing something illegal, civil disobedience, protecting fugitive slaves, that you are really advertising yourself. And at some point when the 1850s stronger Fugitive Slave Act went in, he and his wife decided to destroy all their documentation of slaves they had helped, for fear that if someone got hold of them, they could be able to track them down and re-pull those slaves back into slavery. So they kind of destroyed what documentation they have. So I'm not sure, but I expect there are many people out there, both white and black, who are active in the movement, who are little recognized and have not gotten the recognition they need historically.
He was not born in Philadelphia, he's born down south.
In Charleston,
But he is buried in Philadelphia.
Yes.
Yeah. Where's he buried?
I think in the Fair Hill Cemetery, where I think Lucretia Mott is also buried, one of the famous white Quaker abolitionists of Philadelphia. So.
In an ideal world where the Spring Garden Community Development Corporation could sit down, maybe they had a crystal ball and they could make a wish as to how this whole situation will And we're weeks and months, if not years,
Yeah.
down the road. And the Spring Garden Community Development Corporation should be applauded for their role in being very active and proactive with this property. But I mean, if the organization could hope or had a wish list or look at that crystal ball and say, you know, this is what we would like to see here.
Yeah.
What might that be? What is the end game in all this? Once all the litigation is over and done with, and the judge signs off on the orders, and there's no appeals whatsoever, what is the end game here? What is it that you hope for?
I guess I hoped we would have been able to do something even before the back of the house was torn down, so it was really a fully, could have fully been rehabbed. I think at this point we do hope the building could be restored, at least on externally, since there's internally not there, to at least that it fits within the historic fabric of the neighborhood. And that there is, I do hope going forward that there's more recognition for Robert Purvis and the work he did in Philadelphia. So I think we ultimately hope that it can be developed in a way that fits within the historic nature of the community, and that it's respectful of the property, of his historic nature.
It is possible that a developer might want to come in and maintain the integrity of the property, but wants to put in units, whether apartments or condos or whatever. But might the idea of a museum of some sort, would that work there? I mean, that would be, it would seem to me, a way to pay tribute and honor to this unsung hero.
That would be lovely. That would certainly be lovely. I don't know who's out there, what organizations are out there that have the resources. And I think Philadelphia is a hard city because we have so many historic houses of merit. But there is no particular historic, some that have meaning in terms of the Underground Railroad and anti-slavery. I don't know there's a particular Underground Railroad museum or whatever, and I just don't know the practicality or financial or otherwise for that to happen. But certainly that would be a great idea.
Might there be an effort underway, whether you personally or the corporation, to correct that historical marker that stands outside of the house?
I don't know. We haven't actively looked to do that, but it should be more accurate. It's accurate that it's his house. It's the only one remaining, but it's not accurate that slaves were kept there. If
you really wanted to get a feel and a vibe for Spring Garden, we hear the neighborhood, we hear about that section of the city. You could just drive down, Spring Garden Avenue and see for yourself. I mean, these homes really harken back to a bygone era. And you can really learn a lot just by driving through the neighborhood about what the neighborhood was about. I mean, we talked before the program that just a few blocks from here is where Baldwin Locomotive used to have its factory, where they were building Baldwin locomotive trains just a few blocks from where we're talking about here on Mount Vernon.
And now it's a garden. It's an open space. So.
All in the name of progress, but it's so important and so vital. And I think what you're doing here is that you're maintaining the history of Spring Garden, and there are other neighborhoods where other organizations are doing a fair job in trying to promote their neighborhood. And the part of Philadelphia is a big puzzle. We're all part of this puzzle, and we all come together to form the city of Philadelphia. And it's encouraging to know that a group like yours is working to ensure that not only this one house, but Spring Garden in general. What constitutes the Spring Garden neighborhood? I mean, people say, well, Spring Garden, doesn't that go from Delaware Avenue all the way out to past the Art Museum? What is the actual
Well, we're north of Spring Garden, west of Broad, south of Fairmount, and kind of out toward Pennsylvania Avenue there, before the river. So that's the Spring Garden area. So,
and there are other historic homes that are also in Spring Garden.
From the Stetson Hat mansion, that's on Spring Garden. There's the Bergdahl mansion, which is a huge, beautiful brownstone at 22nd and Green, of German brewers, and there are a variety of other assorted here and there kind of thing, but some lovely historic buildings and things. But I don't know anything else in the neighborhood in terms of the African American community that I know of that stands out besides the Purvis House.
So in the minute that we have left, we should pay tribute to the Spring Garden Community Development Corporation. Who makes up this group?
Well, we're a small group. They were originally an offshoot of the Spring Garden Civic Association, and we're a nonprofit that we work in the neighborhood. We've done some building of new houses. We've done some renovation of affordable housing. We do some active work on the gardens in the neighborhood. The North Street, a small garden around the corner from me, and the big community garden, and make some contributions to the recreation center. And we, for many years, have actually been paying for a part-time art teacher at our local elementary school, the Waring School. We do street cleanings. We do a little summer program for children in the area. And then some kind of social work community service for people who need some supports and need some help. So a variety of different things.
Well, there's a lot going on in Spring Garden, that's for sure, and we have to really thank the Spring Garden Community Development Corporation and Barbara Wolf for being with us here on the program to talk about this house at 1601 Mount Vernon and the gentleman who resided there at one time, Robert Purvis. Barbara, thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Till the next time, my name's Paul Perrello. Thanks so much for being with us here on this edition of the Philly Factor. We'll catch you next time. And we just sit there and